I want to direct our attention to the book of Exodus, chapter 13. Verse 17 reads as follows. When Pharaoh finally let the people go, God did not lead them along the main road that runs through Philistine territory, even though that was the shortest route to the promised land. God said if the people are faced with a battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. Thus far, the word of the Lord. I want to zero in on the first part of that verse, when Pharaoh finally let the people go. When Pharaoh finally let the people go. And I just want to preach a long time coming. The song that we just heard and the mime that we just witnessed, that song was recorded by Sam Cooke and released in February of 1964. It was written out of the personal pain and aspiration after he and his entourage, having made reservations ahead of time at a Holiday Inn in Louisiana, were turned away upon their arrival when the desk clerk saw that they were black. And all of a sudden, that Holiday Inn had no vacancies. When they sought to press the fidelity to the reservation that had been made, they were then jailed for disturbing the peace. And out of that experience and other experiences came this song. Now, this song was placed on the B side of a 45 record. The A side of that was the song Shake. But this song on the B side is considered to be his best and most significant song. There's a sermon there, and that will come later, being on the B side of things. As the verdicts of guilty of second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter against Derek Chauvin were being read by Judge Peter Cahill, the world released a collective sigh and exhalation. The exhalation was preceded by months of despair, distrust, dismay, anxiety, and apprehension around the uncertainty of justice being delivered on behalf of unarmed persons of color dying at the hands of a police officer. Far too often, there's been a failure to pursue charges and a failure to convict when charges have been made. Consequently, upon being alerted that the jury would return a verdict, the angst increased as Minneapolis and cities across the U.S. took active measures preparing for possible violent uprisings in protest of a not guilty or hung jury announcement. Even though the evidence seemed clear and compelling, the historical record of verdicts preconditioned many to hope for the best, but to expect the worst. The presence of Emmett Till's cousin reminds us of how long the denial of a just verdict on behalf of black and brown victims really is. Regrettably, there's a generation that can chart the seasons of their lives by the list of names of such people: Amadou Diallo, Sean Bell, Oscar Grant III, Rekiah Boyd, Chantel Davis, Timothy Russell, Kayla Moore, Jonathan Farrell, Eric Garner, Tyree Woodson, Michael Brown, Tanisha Anderson, Tamir Rice, Walter Lamar Scott, Freddie Gray, Brendan Glenn, Sandra Bland, Jamar Clark, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, Terrence Crutcher, Botham Shem Jean, Elijah McClain, Breonna Taylor, Daniel Prude, and Sean Reed. And just if you're wondering, that's just a part of the list that could be read. Sadly, the transgenerational nature of frustrated hopes and dreams produced a muscle memory that psychologically positioned us for disappointment and anger. But on Tuesday, the nation and the world heard the words guilty 3 times. And those guilty verdicts were a long time coming, not just for the family of George Floyd, but for people of color in America. And as a result, people exhaled, sighed, cried, and cheered. It wasn't so much in celebration, but in affirmation. People sighed and cried and cheered because in this instance, a black life mattered. In this instance, videotape and eyewitness testimony was given the credence that it deserved. In this instance, a vigorous prosecution included police officers all the way up to the chief of police saying this was not right. In this instance, appeals to subliminal racial tropes, blaming the victim and offering illogical theories, neither confused nor distracted the jurors from seeing the truth and expressing it in a guilty verdict. It was a long time coming. And having said that, I'm quite clear about what the verdict does not portend. It does not announce a post-racial America. It does not signify a reformed criminal justice system. It does not equal a transformed policing system. And therefore, it is not the end. But it is a step in the right direction. It is a note in the continued composition of America's symphony of justice and equality. It is a chapter in the saga of our nation's circuitous path to racial conciliation and to wholeness. The sigh, the exhalation, the relief was a response to a sense of this has been a long time coming. However, my friends, this sigh, this exhalation, this relief are not just limited in the matter of criminal justice. This sigh, this exhalation, this sense of release are known to any person or people for whom a desired move, a desired change, a desired reality has been long in appearing and finally arrives. I will imagine that it was the case for Israel. I was particularly struck by the first part of verse 17 of Exodus 13. It reads, when Pharaoh finally let the people go. I know an English professor would remind me that this is not a complete sentence, and therefore it is an incomplete thought. You really can't develop something without it being a complete thought. That's just a phrase. And while I'm aware of that, I want to suggest that when you read it not simply as a phrase, but when you read it within the context of the story that began in chapter 1, you'll find that there's a whole lot of complete thoughts within this statement when Pharaoh finally let the people go. The release of the people had been a long time coming. To be more precise, it was 430 years in the making, beginning with Jacob and his sons' entry into Egypt. The time of Joseph's favor with Pharaoh is eclipsed by a new Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph. And as he witnessed the growth of the Israelites outpacing the growth of the Egyptians, he sees them as a threat to manage. He establishes a system that demeans, that oppresses, that marginalizes, and essentially enslaves. Generations are born and die praying to the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph for deliverance. They loosely hold to the promise that God gave to deliver them, yet generation after generation they saw no positive change. And with each generation holding the hope for a different outcome, each died in disappointment. Is their God real? Does the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob hear the cries of his people? Is this God aware of their plight? And if he is real, if he's heard the cries, and if he's aware of their plight, does he have power equal to or greater than the gods of Egypt and Pharaoh? And if he has power equal to or greater than that of Pharaoh, then why hasn't he done something thus far? What's he waiting on? When is he going to move? How many more have to die in abject oppression and marginalization and enslavement before this God does something? That's how Exodus starts out. And yet we are made aware that in the course of time, a woman by the name of Jochebed gives birth to a son who would later be named Moses, who after being sent in a basket down the Nile River was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, and it was there that she gave him the name Moses, being one who was drawn from the water. While being nursed by his Hebrew birth mother, he's raised as a prince of Egypt. Slowly, his conscience frustrates him to the point that he must do something for his people, and it leads him to murder and prompts his flight from Egypt into the plains of Midian, where he meets a man by the name of Jethro, who welcomes him in exchange for his assistance with his flocks. He marries one of Jethro's daughters and proceeds, and Moses goes from being a prince to a fugitive to a shepherd. It is there that Moses meets God on Mount Horeb, receives God's call to return to Egypt and to tell Pharaoh that God says, "Let my people go." A back and forth that extends across a number of years ensues with Moses' demand and Pharaoh's refusal to let the people go. With each demand and refusal, God responds with a plague upon Egypt that increases in devastation and in intensity. Begins with the Nile River turning into blood, and it will culminate with the death angel striking the firstborn of everyone that did not have the blood of the lamb upon the doorposts. And it was during the night of the death angel's visitation, Pharaoh sent for Moses and ordered him and his people to leave Egypt. It was then that Pharaoh finally let them go. That night became the time when God changed when from being a question to being a declaration. And friend, it may be a long time coming, but God is able to change our whens. For over 400 years, there was the constant and consistent question, when? Having moved to Egypt due to famine, their stay in Egypt was not supposed to be that long. God had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob multiplied seed and land occupied by the Canaanites. Egypt was not supposed to be a permanent stay. At first, they enjoyed the favor of Pharaoh, who had covenanted with Joseph. Things were fine as long as both Joseph and that Pharaoh were alive, and there were those who remembered the two of them, but things changed after that. The desire to go back to their homeland began to grow as their experience of oppression intensified. The question of when would God move began to be more pronounced. When would God hear their prayers? When would God send a deliverer? When would God lift the burden and fulfill his promise? We know that question, don't we? When will justice come? When will vindication appear? When will things change? When will the turnaround occur? When will the healing be felt? When will the door open? When will the burden lift? When will the tears stop? When will the opportunity be presented? When will I laugh again? When Pharaoh finally let them go shows us that God is able to turn our when from a question to a declaration. God moves us from when will God to when God did. They moved from when will Pharaoh let us go to when Pharaoh let us go. God's faithfulness and God's power transforms our whens from questions into statements. Tuesday moved from when will a jury convict an officer of killing an unarmed black person to when the jury convicted Derek Chauvin of killing George Floyd. It may be a long time coming, but God can change our whens. We go from when will God heal to when God healed. From when will God move to when God moved. From when will God provide to when God provided. From when God will make it happen to, let me tell you, when God made it happen. Somebody can testify about God transforming your whens. He moved you from when will you stop crying to when you stopped crying. From when will you laugh again to when you couldn't stop laughing. From when will you ever find love to when you found the one who loved you for who you are. God changed your whens. When will they get it together to when they got it together? When will you break through to when you broke through? And somebody right now can lose it when you think about God changing your whens. For so long, your when was a question, but God moved and God worked, God answered, God lifted, God made. And when God did it, He changed your when from a question to a declaration. Do you recall that when question that plagued you, that dogged you, that hounded you for the time, and then God moved and God changed it from a question and He's given you a declaration. When Pharaoh finally let them go, does not just reveal God's ability to transform our whens, but it says also, it may be a long time coming, but God has the power to overcome our problematic who's. Who's. You see, the first part of Exodus raises the problem of who. More pointedly, who has the power? There is the Pharaoh of Egypt, who is viewed as an Egyptian deity, and there is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This Pharaoh seeks to keep God's people in oppressive servitude. Meanwhile, God desires their freedom. God sends Moses with a message, let my people go. Pharaoh refuses. They're God's people. Pharaoh sees them as his possession. He becomes increasingly hardened in his attempt to keep them enslaved. He structures Egypt with their continued servitude in mind. And thus the dynamic tension is between God's demand to let his people go and Pharaoh's refusal, because Pharaoh sees them as his possession. It is with this that God sends the plagues. And with each plague, Pharaoh seems more intent on keeping God's people. His heart grows in its rejection and resistance to God's mandate. And this continues until the plague of the death angel. And with that plague, Pharaoh's resistance was broken. Pharaoh finally let them go. Look at it. After the Nile turned into blood, after the plague of frogs, the plague of lice, the plague of flies, the plague of murrain, the plague of boils, the plague of hail, the plague of locusts, the plague of darkness, and the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh finally let them go. Friends, on that night, God's power was unmistakable. God's power was greater than the power of the Egyptian idols Osiris and Heka and Geb and Keparah and Apis and Ra. Before God, they have no power. They have no authority. God's power is unmistakable. And Pharaoh's people saw God's work. Pharaoh's people declared, "This is the finger of God." All the people of Egypt urged the people of Israel to leave. God's power was unmistakable, and God's purpose was irresistible. God broke Pharaoh's resistance. He leveled Pharaoh's opposition. He brought Pharaoh into compliance with God's desire for Israel. It was a long time coming. But God overcame Israel's problematic who. You see, whatever stands in opposition to God's purpose in the world and for God's people, God is able to overcome. It may be long in coming, but God is sure to overcome any and all forces in opposition to God's plans and God's purposes. Problematic people are nothing before God. Laban was nothing before God and God's purpose for Jacob. Pharaoh was nothing before God and God's purpose for Israel. Sihon and Og were nothing before God and God's purpose for Israel in taking the land of promise. Red Seas and Jordan rivers and Jericho walls were nothing before God in God's purpose for his people possessing their land. Goliath was nothing before God for David. Saul and Doeg were nothing before God in David's fulfilling God's purpose for his life. Haman was nothing before God as God was seeing, my God, how he would continue the line of his people post-exile, and with Esther and Mordecai being in the right place at the right time. Herod was nothing before God in terms of Jesus. Pilate was nothing before God. And friends, the Confederate States of America was nothing before God. Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson were nothing before God. The Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, the Red Shirts, the White League, and the state Democratic Rifle Clubs were nothing before God. George Wallace and Herman Talmadge and Jim Eastland and John Stennis and Bull Connor and Big Jim Clark were nothing before God. And I got a word, QAnon and birthers and Proud Boys and National Socialist Club and Oath Keepers and Three Percenters. They are nothing before God. God's power is unmistakable, and God's purpose is irresistible. God overcomes problematic who's. God overcomes people and powers and principalities and forces and factors, whoever they are, whatever they are. Sooner or later, they must conform to the power and purpose of God. Sooner or later, they must let go. Sooner or later, their grip must be loosened. Sooner or later, their hold must be canceled. Sooner or later, their term must be ended. It may be a long time coming, but the change must come because God can overcome problematic who. Somebody's about to run out their house because you know of the problematic who's in your life. And you remember the sway that they thought that they had and the hold that they thought that they had and the power that they thought that they had. And maybe you thought that they had that power, but God came through and God showed you that God's power was unmistakable and God's purpose is irresistible. God overcame your problematic who. When Pharaoh finally let them go, reveals one more thing about a long time coming. It's not just God's power to transform our winds. It's not just God's power to overcome our problematic who's. But it is God's faithfulness to perform his what's and to fulfill his why's. My brothers and sisters, it may be a long time coming, But God will perform his whats and fulfill his whys. He's faithful to perform his whats and to fulfill his whys. God's promise to Abraham was first to multiply his seed and to make him into a great nation. The gift of the land was conditioned upon God multiplying the seed and the making of a great nation. While Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob sojourned in the land that would be theirs and owned some property, they were not large enough to take the lands that God had in mind. They did not have the numerical strength to fight and overcome the current inhabitants of the land. Oddly enough, it would be in Egypt that God would multiply the seed and make them into a great people. It was under the weight of their adversity and in the heat of their oppression that God would grow them. Contrary to Pharaoh's expectation, the more that they were afflicted, the more that they multiplied. It took 430 years for them to get to the number of people that would be fit for the journey and for the fight that God moved Pharaoh to finally let them go. When the conditions were right, when everything was in place, God brought Moses from Yoshebed, allowed him time to be a prince of Egypt and have to flee into the plains of Midian, where God would call him up to his own mountain and reveal to him that he is the God of his forefathers and he is his God. And it is his to go and tell Pharaoh, let my people go. God works in Moses and Aaron and the plagues to get Pharaoh to finally let them go. And when Pharaoh finally let them go, God did not lead them the shortest way into the promised land. He led them the long way around, because the God who was faithful in getting them out of Egypt would be faithful in taking them into the land of promise. The God whose past move was over time is the God whose future move over time can be trusted. It may be a long time coming, but understand God is faithful to perform his what and to fulfill his why. It was a long time coming for Abraham and Sarah, but God was faithful with Isaac. It was a long time for Jacob and Rachel, but God was faithful with Joseph and later Benjamin. It was a long time for Joseph and his dreams, but God was faithful in Pharaoh having dreams that he could not interpret and having prepared Joseph to meet the moment. It was a long time for Israel in the wilderness, but God was faithful in their 40 years of wandering, and God worked in such a way that their clothes did not wear out. They had everything that they needed. It was a long time for David, from the time of being anointed by Samuel to actually becoming king of Egypt, but God was faithful. It was a long time, 70 years in exile, but God was faithful to perform what God had in mind and to fulfill his why. He kept them in exile and brought them out and brought them back to Jerusalem because his why had yet to be fulfilled. There was a promise that was still a long time coming, a child to be born, a son to be given, somebody who'd be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. It was a long time. before a virgin conceived and bore a son. But God was faithful with a virgin named Mary conceiving and giving birth to her firstborn child named Jesus. God was faithful in Jesus' growing up and living. God was faithful in God performing his whats and fulfilling his whys. Jesus ushered in the kingdom and brought about change. Lepers experienced change. The lame experienced change. The deaf experience change. The demonically possessed, they experience change. The man born blind could testify it was a long time coming, but Jesus brought a change into my life. The man at the pool of Bethesda could testify it was a long time coming, but Jesus brought change into my life. It was a long time coming, but God was faithful in Jesus at Calvary, being wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquity and chastened for our peace and bearing stripes for our healing. He was faithful in dying for our sins, and God was faithful in raising Jesus from the dead. The God who's been faithful over time is faithful in time. He's still performing his whats. He's still fulfilling his whys. He's still keeping his promises. He's still transforming whens and overcoming problematic who's and performing his whats. I wonder, is there anybody who can say, I've seen the very faithfulness of God transform my whens and overcome my who's, and I'm seeing God perform the whats in my life, and he's fulfilling the whys in my life. It may be a long time coming, but somebody can say, I know that a change is going to come. For somebody wrestling with a when, or you're troubled by a who, I've been sent to tell you, our God is able to transform the when. He's able to overcome the who, to perform the what of your life, and to fulfill the why of your life. It may be a long time coming, but I want to tell you, keep holding on, because if God be for you, Lord have mercy, who can be against you? Keep holding on. Even the youth shall faint and be weary, and the young men and women shall utterly fall. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They'll mount up on wings as eagles. They'll run and not get weary. They'll walk and not. It may be long. You may say, I had fainted unless I had believed to see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. But wait on the Lord and be of good courage, and he will strengthen your heart. It may be a long time coming, but weeping may endure for a night, but joy will come in the morning. Keep holding on. You may be waiting, my God, through evening, and you're wondering, when will you see the sun? Keep holding on. You may be waiting past the night and wondering, when will you see the sun? Keep holding on, because if you hold on, he may not come when you want him, but when he comes, he will come on time. And when he comes, he'll give you a testimony that will start with when God did it, when God made it, when God opened it, and when God provided it, and when God turned it around, and when God broke through, and when God performed what he said he'll do. You just keep on holding on.